The Catcher. In the Rye. Chapter 1. The story begins with Holden Caulfield, the narrator, speaking directly to the reader. He tells us that he has been expelled from Pencey Prep, a prestigious private school. He's not happy about it, but he doesn't feel particularly guilty either. Holden reveals that he's been kicked out of numerous schools for failing his classes. The chapter sets the tone for Holden's sarcastic and disenchanted view of the world. He briefly talks about his little brother, Allie, who passed away from leukemia a few years ago, which still haunts him deeply. Chapter 2. Holden leaves Pencey, and he walks around the school, reflecting on his life and how he feels disconnected from everyone around him. He dislikes most of the people at the school, and he criticizes their behavior and attitudes. He recalls a conversation with his former English teacher, Mr. Spencer, who tries to lecture him about his poor academic performance. Holden doesn't take the advice seriously and leaves, quickly heading for New York City, planning to leave Pencey for good. Chapter 3. On his way out of the school, Holden meets with his roommate, who has been spreading rumors about Holden. He recalls his personal feelings of loneliness and alienation, feeling out of place in the world. He leaves Pencey and heads to New York City. On the train ride, Holden meets a mother of one of the students from Pencey, and he lies to her about his grades and status at school. Despite his discomfort with the lies, Holden continues to fabricate stories to avoid feeling vulnerable. Chapter 4. Upon arriving in New York City, Holden checks into a hotel and begins exploring the city. He reflects on his failed relationships with various people in his life, including his parents and siblings. He feels like an outsider, constantly observing others but never fully engaging. His loneliness and alienation deepen as he tries to connect with people, but they all seem shallow or fake. He meets a girl named Sally, with whom he spends some time. He can't shake his sense of dissatisfaction. Chapter 5. Holden continues to roam New York City, growing increasingly disillusioned with the world around him. He recalls his childhood memories, particularly of his brother Allie, whose death still affects him deeply. Holden's emotional instability is becoming more apparent as he grapples with depression and feelings of loss. He feels that people are phony, and he can't find solace in anything, not even the superficial things he tries to distract himself with. Chapter 6. While wandering through the city, Holden encounters a former schoolmate, Luce, who has grown up and become somewhat of an intellectual. The conversation with Luce is uncomfortable and reveals Holden's discomfort with maturity and adulthood. He tries to impress Luce with his views on life, but struggles to express his inner turmoil. The chapter emphasizes Holden's inability to find a genuine connection with others. Chapter 7. Holden continues to wander through the city, feeling increasingly lost and confused. He is constantly seeking something to give his life meaning, but he can't find it. He remembers his brother Allie and how he died from leukemia, and he is unable to let go of the grief he feels. His mental health continues to deteriorate, and he isolates himself even further from others, unable to face the reality of his emotions. Chapter 8. As Holden's journey through New York continues, he becomes more desperate for human connection. He calls an old friend, Jane Gallagher, whom he has not seen in years, but he never reaches her. Jane represents the only person who ever truly understood him, and the inability to reach her reflects his ongoing sense of isolation and loneliness. Holden tries to find solace in the idea of Jane, but knows deep down that he's lost her forever. Chapter 9. Holden's journey becomes more erratic, and he starts to question his own sanity. He experiences a series of encounters with people that further emphasize his disillusionment with the world. He also begins to fantasize about protecting children from the harshness of the adult world. This idea is symbolized by his fantasy of being the catcher in the rye, someone who can prevent children from falling into the adult world's corruption. Chapter 10. Holden's behavior becomes increasingly erratic, and he begins to spiral into deeper depression. He becomes fixated on the idea of innocence and purity, constantly seeking out moments of beauty in a world he feels is consumed by superficiality. He spends time in Central Park, reflecting on his life and the people he has lost, but he cannot find peace. He clings to the idea of protecting children from the adult world, but feels powerless to do so. Chapter 11. As Holden's mental state deteriorates, he reflects more on the past and the people he's encountered. He becomes fixated on the idea of his little brother, Allie, who died of leukemia. This memory haunts him, and he begins to imagine that Allie is still with him. Holden becomes increasingly detached from reality and begins to struggle with distinguishing between the past and the present. Chapter 12. Holden's journey becomes even more erratic and unpredictable. He has a series of random encounters with strangers, none of which provide him with any comfort or relief. He is constantly searching for something meaningful in a world that feels empty and hollow. His isolation continues to grow as he becomes more and more withdrawn, unable to connect with anyone around him. Chapter 13. As Holden's mental health continues to decline, he becomes more consumed by feelings of anger and frustration. He is frustrated with the world around him and the people he interacts with, feeling as if they are all phony and superficial. He longs for genuine human connection, but finds it increasingly difficult to achieve. Chapter 14. Holden has a series of conversations with people, including his sister Phoebe, who is one of the few people in his life who seems to genuinely care for him. However, Holden's isolation continues to grow, and he is unable to accept the love and care that others offer him. He is convinced that he is different from everyone else and that no one will ever truly understand him. Chapter 15. Holden's mental state continues to deteriorate, and he becomes increasingly paranoid and detached from reality. He fantasizes about leaving the world behind and escaping to a place where he can be free from the pain and loneliness he feels. He imagines running away to a cabin in the woods, away from society, but deep down he knows this is just another fantasy. Chapter 16. As Holden continues to spiral into deeper despair, he becomes obsessed with the idea of death. He contemplates the idea of disappearing and escaping his life, but he is also terrified of the thought. He spends more time reflecting on his brother Allie, whose death still weighs heavily on him. His grief is consuming him, and he is unable to find a way to cope with it. Chapter 17. Holden becomes more erratic, unable to focus on anything for long. He constantly questions his own actions and the motives of others. His isolation grows as he pushes people away, unable to connect with anyone. He becomes fixated on the idea of protecting the innocence of children, but he is powerless to stop the inevitable march of time. Chapter 18. Holden's mental state continues to deteriorate, and he becomes more and more consumed by his fantasies and delusions. He imagines himself as a hero, protecting the world from corruption, but deep down, he knows this is just a way to escape the pain and confusion he feels. Chapter 19. Holden's life reaches a breaking point as he becomes increasingly detached from reality. He struggles to make sense of his emotions and his place in the world. He reflects on his childhood, his family, and his relationships, but is unable to find meaning or comfort in any of it. Chapter 20. As Holden's breakdown becomes more severe, he begins to have vivid hallucinations. He is overwhelmed by a sense of hopelessness and despair, and he becomes obsessed with the idea of disappearing. He has a breakdown in Central Park and is eventually hospitalized. Chapter 21. Holden is hospitalized, and the novel ends with him reflecting on his journey. He realizes that he is not alone in his pain and that he still has people who care about him. While his future is uncertain, there is a glimmer of hope as he begins to accept the help he needs. This summary covers the major events and themes in each chapter of The Catcher in the Rye. The book explores themes of alienation, loneliness, and the struggle for identity, all wrapped in Holden's disillusioned view of the world.